Aurelian 5 was a beautiful world once, full of bright blue oceans, floating crystal forests, and gentle winds that carried the smell of sweet pollen across the continents. People lived in tall, shining cities that touched the clouds, and life moved in a calm, peaceful rhythm. But slowly, over many years, everything had begun to fall apart. Strange storms were forming without warning. The oceans were growing acidic. Forests were dying so fast that entire regions turned brown in a single season. At first, scientists believed they could fix it. They built machines to clean the air, they planted new forests, and they tried to block the storms with weather towers. Nothing worked. The planet was collapsing faster than anyone could understand. As the destruction grew, fear settled across Aurelian 5 like a heavy shadow. The news channels were filled with emergency reports. Families gathered in their homes at night, silently worrying about what would happen next. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Government officials worked day and night, but every solution failed. More cities were hit by floods. More farms turned to dust. The leaders of the planet knew their world had entered a crisis that they could no longer control. In one final meeting held inside the council chamber, the leaders made a decision they had hoped to avoid. They would send a distress signal into the galaxy. It was something no planet ever did lightly, because asking for help meant admitting absolute failure, and no one knew who might answer the call. The galaxy was full of different species, some kind, some curious, some dangerous, but Aurelian 5 had no choice. Their world was dying. Their people were running out of time. The chief engineer, a quiet woman named Lyra Ven, stood in front of a giant transmitter shaped like a silver ring. Her hands shook as she prepared the emergency broadcast. She understood that once the message was sent, it could not be taken back. Anyone, anywhere, could hear it. She whispered a small prayer, something she had not done since she was a child, and pressed the activation panel. The distress signal shot into space like a bright pulse, a message filled with desperation. It carried the details of their ecological disaster, their need for help, and the exact location of their planet. But space was enormous, and messages often got lost in the darkness. After the signal left, everyone waited. Hours passed, then days, then weeks. No reply came. People tried to continue their daily lives, but fear grew stronger each day. The skies turned strange colors. Dust storms swept over cities. Birds vanished. The planet felt sick, almost as if it was crying for help along with its people. Many wondered if the signal had failed or if no one cared. A few asked if they had made a terrible mistake by calling out to the unknown. Still, hope lingered. Each night, families gathered around broadcast screens waiting for news. In schools, children drew pictures of alien helpers arriving with bright lights and advanced machines. In the council chamber, the leaders checked the communication systems again and again, hoping for the smallest sign of a response. One morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern horizon, something strange happened. The long-range scanners detected a faint movement far beyond their star system. At first, the technicians dismissed it as space dust or a drifting asteroid, but as the hours passed, the signal grew stronger, clearer, and more organized. Someone or something was coming. When the announcement was made, the entire planet reacted at once. Some people celebrated, believing rescue was finally on the way. Others panicked, fearing that whoever responded might not be friendly. Old stories about hostile species resurfaced. Neighbors argued, families worried, and the government tried to calm everyone. No one knew if salvation or destruction was approaching. Aurelian 5 had always been peaceful, and their military was small. Their defensive systems were weak compared to other civilizations. If a dangerous species arrived, they would have no real way to fight back. The only thing they could do was hope the visitors understood the message the way it was meant, a plea for help, not a sign of war. By the end of the week, the approaching presence moved into the outer edge of the star system. Scientists watched the screens closely. Their faces went pale as the first clear readings appeared. The incoming fleet was enormous, far larger than any relief or aid group would ever need. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of massive ships were traveling together in a perfect formation. Their engines burned brighter than small suns. Their metal hulls glinted with battle scars, and their speed suggested terrifying power. The people of Aurelian 5 gathered in open plazas, staring at the large screens that displayed the blurry shapes of the incoming fleet. Even though the images were distant and unclear, everyone felt the same cold shiver travel down their spine. This did not look like help. This looked like an army. Rumors began spreading faster than officials could control them. Some claimed the fleet belonged to an ancient empire known for conquering worlds. Others believed that the ships were filled with mercenaries who looted dying planets. A few whispered the most frightening theory of all, that these ships belonged to the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were a name almost everyone had heard, but no one had ever met. They came from some of the harshest planets in the universe, worlds filled with deadly beasts, poisonous air, violent storms, and constant danger. Any creature that managed to survive such places grew strong, clever, and incredibly tough. And the Deathworlders were more than strong, they were feared. Stories claimed they could tear metal with their hands or walk through fires that would kill others. Some tales said they saved planets. Others said they destroyed them. No one knew which stories were true. As hours passed, more details of the approaching fleet were confirmed. The ships were heavily armed. Their hulls matched the descriptions of Deathworld or warcraft. The energy signatures showed weapons powerful enough to break moons, and they were heading straight for a URELI on -5. The council held an emergency meeting. People argued about whether to send a second message explaining the situation again, but there was no guarantee the fleet would listen. Others suggested shutting down the communication systems entirely and pretending the planet was uninhabited. But that idea was quickly dismissed. It was too late. The fleet already knew their location. By now, the entire planet was watching the sky. Children clung to their parents. Adults whispered prayers. Scientists stared at their instruments in disbelief. Everyone hoped the worst stories about the Deathworlders were nothing more than but the truth was, no one could predict what these mysterious beings would do. When the first ship appeared as a tiny point of light in the morning sky, the world held its breath. The light grew bigger, brighter, transforming into a huge metal shape moving at impossible speed. More ships followed, each one larger and more threatening than the last. They moved silently, casting cold shadows across the land as they entered orbit. People felt a mix of wonder and terror. The ships were beautiful in a terrifying way, massive, ancient, covered in strange symbols and scars from unknown battles. Engines hummed with a deep, powerful vibration that could be felt through the ground. No message came from the ships. No greeting, no warning, only silence. That silence was worse than any threat. It meant the Deathworlders were studying them, watching them, deciding something. The people of Aurelian 5 felt helpless. Their distress call had been received. Yes, but by the one species they feared the most. The strange thing was, no one could tell yet whether the Deathworlders had come to help or to destroy. The fleet hovered above the planet like a giant, silent judge, and the fate of Aurelian 5 hung on a terrible question no one could answer. All they could do now was wait and hope their message had reached the right hearts, not the wrong ones. As the massive fleet drew closer to Aurelian, the planet's citizens began to realize just how serious the situation was. What they had hoped would be some kind of help from the galaxy was turning into something far more terrifying. The first glimpses of the incoming ships filled the sky, even from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. Their size was unlike anything the people had ever imagined. Each ship was larger than the biggest city on Aurelian 5, with hulls that gleamed like dark steel, and edges that cut sharply through space. Some of the ships had strange structures protruding from their sides, towers, weapon mounts, and unknown devices that hummed with quiet, deadly energy. It became clear that this was not a fleet of rescuers. This was a fleet built for war, for total dominance, for destruction. The leaders of Aurelian 5 watched in stunned silence from the planetary command center. Sensors and scanners displayed wave after wave of ships moving in perfect formation, as if they were alive and thinking together. The formations were so precise that it seemed impossible for so many massive vessels to move without colliding, yet they flowed like a single organism through the vacuum of space. Officers tried to calculate the strength of the fleet, running simulations of what might happen if they attacked or if the fleet attacked them. Every scenario ended the same way. The fleet could crush the planet's defenses without even trying. Panic began to spread through the command center. Outside, the citizens could feel the presence of the fleet even before it was fully visible. The sky grew darker, and strange vibrations passed through the ground as the ships moved into orbit. Rumors spread faster than ever. Some said that the ships could fire weapons that would vaporize entire continents in seconds. Others whispered that the Deathworlders were infamous for doing this to planets that sent distress signals without understanding the risks. Families gathered together, trying to stay calm, but fear gripped everyone. Children hid under tables, while adults stared at the sky in disbelief. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to understand what they were seeing. They realized that the ships were not only huge but incredibly advanced. Their engines emitted energy patterns the scientists had never seen before. The fleet's shields were visible even from the planet's surface, glowing faintly with a strange light that suggested the ships could withstand almost any attack. The weapons mounted on the fleet were enormous, far beyond anything Aurelian 5 had ever faced. Some of the warships had giant cannons capable of destroying mountains from orbit. Others had strange devices that emitted pulses of energy strong enough to destabilize the atmosphere. The planet's defense systems seemed like toys compared to the overwhelming power of the Deathworld fleet. Meanwhile, the people struggled to come to terms with what they were seeing. The streets emptied as citizens sought shelter. Some ran to the mountains, hoping the terrain could protect them. Others hid in underground bunkers, praying that the fleet would not notice them. Panic created chaos. Traffic jams blocked escape routes, and supply shortages began almost immediately as people rushed to stock up on essentials. Communication networks became overloaded with messages, many of them cries for help, others warnings and frantic theories about the fleet's intentions. The leaders of Aurelian 5 held emergency meetings every few hours, trying to figure out what to do. Diplomats debated whether to attempt a new communication with the fleet, sending messages begging for mercy and explaining their situation. Military commanders, however, feared that any new message could provoke the fleet further. No one knew if the Deathworlders would even understand their language or their intentions. Meanwhile, the planet's scientists tried to prepare defenses, though they knew it was almost hopeless. They constructed temporary energy barriers, missile defense grids, and emergency evacuation plans. But each solution felt insufficient in the face of such overwhelming power. On the ground, fear and awe mixed in strange ways. People could not take their eyes off the sky. Even those who had never looked at space before now spent hours watching the massive ships move slowly but purposefully in orbit. The size and strength of the fleet were mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Many people admitted privately that they had never imagined such power existed in the universe. Stories of ancient battles and legendary fleets seemed real now, as if something from the myths had come alive above their planet. The fleet's presence also created unusual environmental effects. Electromagnetic interference from the ships caused lights to flicker, communication signals to drop, and even the weather to behave unpredictably. Sudden gusts of wind, minor tremors, and strange cloud formations began to occur, which many believed were signs of the fleet's power. Scientists confirmed that these were indeed effects caused by the fleet's proximity, but the average citizen only knew that the world was changing in a way they could not control. On the command center, the planetary leaders debated whether to show the citizens the true scale of the fleet. They feared panic might turn into chaos if everyone fully understood how powerful the Deathworlders were. At the same time, keeping the truth hidden felt dishonest and potentially dangerous, since people needed to make choices about safety. Ultimately, they decided to show live images, hoping that understanding the threat would prepare citizens to follow instructions calmly. The live feeds shocked the population even more. Ships that seemed small in the distance turned out to be enormous as the cameras zoomed in. Each one was covered with strange markings, scars from battles fought on unknown worlds, and technological appendages that suggested unimaginable capabilities. People could see launch bays, towers bristling with weapons, and glowing panels that pulsed with energy. Some citizens speculated wildly about what the fleet might do first. Others feared the worst, that the fleet would fire without warning and end life on the planet in moments for the first time in generations. Aurelian 5 experienced a collective fear that united everyone. Differences in class, wealth, and background suddenly felt insignificant compared to the overwhelming presence in the sky. Citizens began helping one another, sharing supplies, and checking on neighbors. Schools became shelters. Community centers opened as emergency housing. Even as panic persisted, small acts of cooperation and humanity began to appear. People realized that while they could not fight the fleet, they could protect each other as best they could. As the days passed, the fleet did not fire a single shot. It moved in slow, deliberate patterns, circling the planet like a predator studying its prey. The silence was terrifying. The people of Aurelian 5 began to understand that this fleet had come not for trade or diplomacy, but for something far more serious. Scientists hypothesized that the Deathworlders were evaluating the planet and its inhabitants, perhaps determining if they posed any kind of threat. Military leaders feared the worst, imagining that the slightest mistake could trigger destruction. Citizens noticed that the fleet seemed to respond to signals they could not see or understand. Small maneuvers, shifts in formation, and changes in orbital patterns suggested intelligence and coordination far beyond human comprehension. It became clear that the fleet was not mindless. It was calculating, watching, and waiting. This realization added another layer of tension, that people were living under the gaze of a species that could destroy them with ease, yet remained silent. Families struggled with fear and hope at the same time. Parents tried to comfort their children, but the sheer size of the ships and the overwhelming sense of power made reassurance difficult. Some adults prayed, some meditated, some attempted to reason scientifically, but no one could escape the feeling that their entire world was at the mercy of beings beyond imagination. News outlets broadcast updates constantly, trying to maintain calm, but the truth was impossible to sugarcoat. People were terrified, and they had every reason to be. As night fell, the fleet continued to hang in orbit, their lights visible even in darkness. The sight was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. From below, it looked like the stars themselves had come down, forming metal giants ready to act. Citizens looked up from their homes, streets, and shelters, holding hands, whispering prayers, or just staring in stunned silence. The leaders of Aurelian 5 convened yet again to decide on the next step. They debated sending another communication, trying to clarify their intentions, and explaining that their planet was not a threat. Others argued that any attempt might provoke the fleet. They considered hiding their cities or evacuating critical populations, but resources were limited and time was short. Every option seemed risky, and none promised safety. The planet had no choice but to wait. The Deathworld fleet was enormous, terrifying, and silent. Every eye on Aurelian 5 remained glued to the sky, every mind filled with questions about whether these beings had come to destroy or to help. The air was tense, thick with anticipation, and even the simplest activities felt overshadowed by the massive, unblinking presence above. Aurelian 5 realized the full meaning of power and fear. They understood that no matter how advanced or peaceful they were, there were forces in the universe far beyond their control. And yet, despite the terror, a small spark of hope remained, the knowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, the beings above might not be here to destroy them, but for a reason they could not yet understand. The people waited, holding their breath, as the most dangerous fleet they had ever seen hung over their world, silent, calculating, and ready to act. As the massive Deathworlder fleet continued to hang over Array, the people of the planet became more desperate by the hour. The initial shock of seeing such enormous ships had faded slightly, but it was replaced by a growing panic and confusion. No one knew what the fleet's true intentions were. The signals and movements of the Deathworlders were unreadable to the people, leaving them in a state of tense uncertainty. For days, the world seemed frozen. Every decision, every word, every glance was filled with fear. Because one mistake could bring unimaginable destruction from above. The planetary leaders tried to maintain calm, but inside the command centers, the tension was unbearable. The leaders had assumed the worst from the beginning. After all, the fleet was far larger than any relief convoy could ever be. It was not equipped with medical supplies, ecological restoration equipment, or emergency aid modules. Instead, it was bristling with weapons and shield systems built for total planetary domination. In response, Aurelian 5's military scrambled to prepare defensive positions. They activated missile batteries, energy shields, and surfaced orbit weapons that had never been tested in combat. The idea was simple. If the Deathworlders attacked, they would try to fight back, even if it meant certain death. The citizens were told to remain calm and follow emergency protocols, but it was nearly impossible. Streets were empty, except for those moving to emergency shelters or supply centers. Schools were converted into temporary safe zones. Hospitals were on high alert, ready for both potential injuries and the possibility of mass casualties. Families huddled together in their homes, staring at the sky, waiting for what might come. Children asked endless questions, and parents could give no answers. Scientists tried to reassure the public, explaining that the Deathworlders might not be hostile, but no one believed it. The fleet's overwhelming size and power made it impossible to imagine anything but destruction. As preparations for possible defense continued, the first contact attempt was made. The planetary leaders sent a new transmission, carefully constructed to explain their situation. They emphasized that the distress signal had been a call for ecological help, not a threat. They described the dying planet, the collapsing ecosystems, and the desperate need for aid. The message was polite and detailed, but also urgent. The hope was that someone in the fleet would understand and respond correctly. Hours passed with no reply. The silence was unbearable. Citizens could see the ships above in their screens and through their windows, moving in slow, calculated patterns that suggested intelligence and awareness. Every adjustment in orbit, every change in formation, made people feel as though the fleet was studying them, evaluating their every move. The fear of misunderstanding grew stronger. Could one wrong message or signal provoke the Deathworlders into attacking? Could a simple human mistake end everything? The leaders worried constantly, unable to relax even for a moment. Meanwhile, the planetary military assumed the fleet was hostile. They calculated the potential strength of the Deathworlders' weapons, trying to plan a defensive strategy that could survive an initial attack. Every analysis suggested it was impossible. Even their most advanced weapons would be destroyed instantly. Some officers suggested hiding the population in underground shelters while abandoning the cities above. Others argued that attempting to engage the fleet was suicidal but might be necessary to show the Deathworlders that the planet could fight back if provoked. Disagreement and fear filled the command rooms. On the streets, the people were struggling to maintain normal lives. Markets closed, transportation ceased, and the hum of ordinary activity disappeared. Citizens were glued to screens and news updates, watching the massive ships as they moved silently above the planet. Many began to speculate wildly about the Deathworlders' intentions. Some said that the fleet had misinterpreted the distress signal as a call for help against a powerful planetary threat. Others feared the worst, believing that the Deathworlders had arrived to wipe out the planet in case it posed a danger. Families huddled together, some crying silently, some holding on to hope that the fleet would not attack. The misunderstanding, however, ran even deeper than the leaders realized. The Deathworlders were indeed analyzing Aurelian 5, but they had completely misinterpreted the initial distress signal. The technology used to send the message had emitted patterns that, to the Deathworlders, indicated the presence of a potential planetary-scale threat. To them, the planet appeared to be signaling that it faced an unstoppable destructive force, something that could spread across space and threaten entire systems. That was why they had arrived with their destruction fleet. They were prepared to eliminate the threat entirely. What they did not realize was that the signal did not indicate danger. It was simply a cry for help. This misunderstanding caused tension to reach almost unbearable levels. On Aurelian 5, the citizens had no way of knowing that the fleet's destructive posture was based on a misreading of their signal. All they knew was that hundreds of massive ships, equipped with weapons capable of destroying their world, were hanging silently in orbit. They could only wait and prepare for what seemed like an inevitable attack. Every day, the people felt the pressure more intensely. Some citizens became frantic, attempting to flee the cities and escape to less populated regions. Others refused to leave, believing that shelters or underground facilities offered better protection. The uncertainty created chaos, but also an unusual form of unity as people realized that survival depended on cooperation. Inside the command center, scientists worked day and night to understand the Deathworlders' fleet and find a way to communicate effectively. They analyzed the ship's energy signatures, movement patterns, and signal outputs. They attempted to create a universal message that would clarify the misunderstanding, hoping to convey that Aurelian 5 was a peaceful planet in need of help, not a dangerous threat. Meanwhile, military strategists ran countless simulations of what might happen if the fleet decided to attack. Each scenario was more terrifying than the last. The planet had almost no chance against such overwhelming power. The psychological impact on the population was enormous. Fear, anxiety, and tension dominated daily life. Citizens reported sleepless nights, panic attacks, and constant stress. Children were confused and frightened, asking questions about death, war, and the future. Adults felt powerless and helpless, realizing that no matter what they did, their world could be destroyed in an instant. Religious leaders attempted to calm the population, offering prayers and ceremonies. But even these gestures could not erase the deep fear that gripped everyone. Despite all this fear, there were moments of hope and bravery. Citizens worked together to organize emergency shelters, distribute supplies, and maintain communication networks. Volunteer groups formed to help vulnerable populations, bringing food, water, and comfort to those in need. Scientists shared knowledge with the public about the nature of the fleet, trying to educate and prepare them without increasing panic. Communities bonded in ways they never had before, united by the common goal of survival. During this phase, it became clear that the misunderstanding between Aurelian 5 and the Deathworlders was a dangerous but invisible threat. The fleet's approach, preparation, and immense power created constant stress for everyone on the planet. People feared that a single mistake, a misinterpreted signal, a wrong maneuver, a miscommunication could trigger disaster. They had no idea that the fleet's destructive appearance was not intentional aggression but a precaution based on a misreading. This invisible misunderstanding became as dangerous as any weapon because it created fear, chaos, and uncertainty on a massive scale. As the days passed, tension remained high, but the fleet did not attack. It maintained its silent, slow movements in orbit, watching, calculating, and waiting. The people began to notice subtle patterns in the ship's behavior. Certain areas of the planet were scanned more thoroughly, while others were largely ignored. Energy readings suggested that the fleet's sensors were highly advanced, capable of detecting even minor signs of life and technological activity. Scientists theorized that the Deathworlders were conducting a thorough analysis before making any decisions. Meanwhile, Aurelian 5's leaders prepared for every possible scenario. Evacuation plans, communication protocols, and defense strategies were continually revised and tested. Citizens participated in drills, although many were terrified to leave their homes. The presence of the fleet forced the entire planet to confront its vulnerability and the limits of its technology. The people realized that the galaxy was full of forces far beyond their control, and that survival required patience, intelligence, and careful observation. Despite the fear, small signs of life and hope continued to appear. Children drew pictures of peaceful alien visitors, imagining that the fleet might be there to help instead of harm. Some adults held on to optimism, believing that if they remained calm and cooperative, the fleet might understand their situation. Scientists continued working tirelessly to create messages that could clarify the misunderstanding, hoping that a single correct signal could prevent disaster. Communities organized support networks, helping each other to endure the psychological stress caused by the fleet's overwhelming presence. On this phase, Aurelian 5's people experienced a mixture of fear, awe, and hope. The misunderstanding of the Deathworlders' intentions created tension and uncertainty, but it also forced the planet to unite, innovate, and prepare in ways never seen before. Citizens realized the fragility of their civilization, but they also discovered resilience, cooperation, and courage. The fleet remained silent, its true purpose unknown, leaving the planet in a state of tense anticipation. As time passed, both fear and hope existed side by side. Every scan, every signal, every movement of the fleet became a test of patience and intelligence. The people of Aurelian 5 had to remain calm, cooperative, and vigilant. They could not fight the fleet, but they could work to ensure survival through careful observation, preparation, and clear communication. In this phase, the planet understood that misunderstanding could be as dangerous as any weapon, and that clarity, patience, and courage might be the only tools to survive what appeared to be an impossible situation. Aurelian 5 remained under the shadow of the fleet, its people united in fear and hope, preparing for the unknown while clinging to the belief that understanding and patience could prevent the disaster they all feared. The misunderstanding continued. But the planet learned that survival required more than weapons. It required wisdom, cooperation, and courage in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Days had passed since the massive Deathworlder fleet had arrived in orbit over Array, and the planet was still tense with fear and uncertainty. Every person on the planet, from the highest government officials to the youngest child, had been holding their breath, waiting to see what the Deathworlders would do. The planet had been preparing for the worst, expecting complete destruction at any moment. And yet, as terrifying as the fleet was, it remained silent, moving slowly, calculating, and observing. The people could not understand the intentions behind the massive ships, and the fear of an imminent attack had reached its peak. Inside the command center, the planetary leaders continued to send messages, trying desperately to explain that their planet was peaceful, that their people posed no threat, and that the original distress call had been a request for help. They explained that Aurelian 5 was dying and that they needed assistance to restore its ecosystems. Every transmission was carefully constructed to avoid any hint of aggression. Still, there was no immediate response. The silence from the fleet made every passing hour feel like a lifetime. Then, slowly, the first communication came not through words or messages in the languages of Aurelian, but through direct signals transmitted to their planetary systems. It was subtle at first, minor adjustments in the fleet's formations, changes in the energy readings, and pulses that were easily overlooked. Scientists noticed the anomalies and began decoding them. They realized that the Deathworlders were not ignoring them. They were trying to communicate, but in a way that the people of Aurelian 5 had never encountered before. The signals were sophisticated, complex, and based on principles that took hours for the scientists to understand. Once the first signals were decoded, a stunning realization hit everyone. The Deathworlders had misunderstood the original distress call. Their analysis of the signal suggested that Aurelian 5 was not under threat from a destructive entity, but their system had misinterpreted the message as a warning about a planet-scale danger. That was why they had arrived with their full destruction fleet, prepared to obliterate anything that might threaten the galaxy. The initial fear that the fleet was coming to attack had been based entirely on a misunderstanding. The revelation was both shocking and relieving. The fleet had come ready to destroy, not because Aurelian 5 had angered them, but because they believed the planet was a threat. And now that they realized the planet posed no danger, a decision was being made that no one had expected. The fleet was going to help. The idea was almost unimaginable. The same beings that were feared across the galaxy, capable of annihilating worlds, were now going to save one instead. The people of Aurelian 5 could hardly believe it. The Deathworlders' first actions were cautious. Their ships moved closer to the planet. But rather than deploying weapons of destruction, they began scanning the surface in detail. Sensors mapped every river, forest, and city. Machines were deployed to assess soil quality, water purity, and atmospheric conditions. Their technology was far beyond anything Aurelian 5 had ever seen. Devices that could analyze entire ecosystems in seconds were activated, and the data collected was overwhelming in its depth and precision. The fleet was working with the efficiency of a species that had survived countless harsh worlds, applying knowledge and technology that was practically magical to the people of a Aurelion-5. Next came the first tangible assistance. The Deathworlders deployed massive terraforming equipment designed to restore ecosystems on a planetary scale. Rivers that had dried up were refilled. Air purifiers removed toxic particles from the atmosphere. Machines capable of accelerating plant growth were deployed in forests that had turned brown. Soil regeneration systems restored nutrients to barren lands. Cities that had been suffering from acid rains and toxic dust suddenly had cleaner air and stabilized weather. The planet's people watched in awe as the same technology that could destroy worlds was now being used to heal theirs. The planetary leaders were both relieved and astonished. Every plan for evacuation, defense, and survival became unnecessary as the Deathworlders worked systematically to repair the damage. The planetary scientists collaborated as best they could, guided by the Deathworlders' instructions and technology. A new partnership formed, one built not on fear, but on necessity, understanding, and cooperation. It was the first time in the planet's history that its people had worked so closely with an alien species, especially one that was so powerful and feared. As the restoration continued, it became clear how advanced the Deathworlders were. Their systems did not just repair damage, they optimized the environment for the long-term survival of the planet. Rivers were not just restored, their flow was managed to prevent future flooding. Forests were replanted with species that could thrive under changing conditions. Atmospheric regulators maintained balance to prevent future storms. Even the ocean currents were subtly adjusted to support marine life. Aurelian 5 was being transformed, not just repaired. It was evolving under the guidance of a species that had mastered survival on the harshest worlds imaginable. The citizens of Aurelian 5 were in a state of wonder. For weeks, fear had dominated their lives, but now they watched as their world healed before their eyes. The streets filled with people observing the work being done, some photographing the machines and ships, others simply staring in awe. Children were no longer hiding from the unknown, they were fascinated by it. Adults who had spent sleepless nights worrying now whispered in disbelief at the scale and precision of the restoration. For the first time in generations, hope had returned in a tangible form. Despite the awe and relief, the presence of the Deathworlders remained intimidating. Even as they helped, their sheer size, advanced technology, and silence reminded everyone that these were beings capable of immense power. The people had to remind themselves that the same fleet that could destroy them in moments was now choosing to save them. This understanding created a deep sense of gratitude mixed with lingering caution. The people respected the Deathworlders not only for their strength, but for their decision to help rather than destroy. The process of restoration took weeks. Forests regrew at astonishing speed, oceans cleared, and cities stabilized. Weather systems returned to predictable patterns, and the air was clean once more. Rivers flowed with life-giving water, and fields that had been barren were ready to support crops again. Animals that had been on the brink of extinction returned to restored habitats. The planet, once dying, now seemed vibrant and alive. It was as if the Death had not only fixed the damage but had given Aurelian 5 a second chance and new lease on life. The planetary leaders organized a communication to formally thank the Death. Though even this felt inadequate, words could not capture the gratitude, relief and awe that filled the hearts of everyone on the planet. Instead, they focused on cooperating fully, sharing knowledge, and learning how to maintain the systems the Deathworlders had implemented. Scientists worked tirelessly to understand the alien technology, hoping to continue the improvements long after the fleet left. Finally, when the restoration was complete, the Deathworlder fleet prepared to leave. The ships that had once filled the sky with a terrifying presence now felt like guardians. They vanished silently, leaving no fanfare, no announcement, and no warning. The people of Aurelian 5 were left to marvel at what had happened. Their planet had been saved by the same beings they had feared most in the galaxy. The experience had changed them forever. They had faced a seemingly impossible threat, and had witnessed a power so great that it could have destroyed everything, yet chose instead to preserve life. The people of Aurelian 5 understood the full weight of what had occurred. They had learned that fear often arises from misunderstanding, and that even the most powerful beings could act with compassion and wisdom. Their planet had been transformed, not just physically, but in the way its people viewed the universe. They had survived, healed, and grown stronger not through their own power, but through the unexpected help of the Death. The phase ended with a mix of awe, relief, and a newfound hope, as Aurelian 5 stood renewed and its people forever changed by the experience. After the massive Deathworlder fleet completed its extraordinary work of restoring the planet entered a period of quiet reflection and awe. For weeks, life had been under the shadow of the fleet, and the people had been caught between fear and hope. Now, with the ships leaving silently, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. The transformation of the planet was nothing short of miraculous. Rivers, once polluted and dead, now flowed crystal clear, nourishing the lands around them. Forests had returned, thick and vibrant, teeming with life, and the skies were free of the toxic haze that had once choked the planet. Even the weather, which had been chaotic and destructive, had stabilized into predictable patterns that allowed for safe travel, farming, and everyday life once more. The citizens of Aurelian 5 emerged from their shelters and homes, cautiously, almost afraid to believe what they were seeing. Children ran through the streets, touching plants that had grown overnight, feeling the fresh air fill their lungs, and marveling at the renewed wildlife. Adults wandered through neighborhoods that had been damaged or abandoned, amazed at how buildings, roads, and parks had been restored with precise perfection. The planet no longer seemed like the dying world they had feared. It seemed alive, almost as if it had been reborn. Families hugged each other tightly, many shedding tears of relief and disbelief. For a moment, the fears of destruction that had dominated life for weeks seemed to vanish. The leaders of Aurelian 5 held an emergency assembly in the capital city, gathering representatives from every corner of the planet. Their first task was to assess the changes made by the Deathworlders and to plan for how to maintain them. Scientists and engineers, previously overwhelmed with the disaster, were now in a state of wonder as they examined the alien technology. Machines that could accelerate plant growth, purify water, stabilize weather, and balance ecosystems were far beyond anything Aurelian 5 had ever possessed. Their complexity was intimidating, but they also represented a new chance for the planet. For the first time in generations, the planet's leaders were not only reacting to crises, they were being given the tools to shape a sustainable and thriving future. Every corner of the planet reflected the work of the Deathworlders. Fields that had once been barren were now rich and fertile, ready to sustain crops for generations. Forests, teeming with new species of plants and animals, extended across continents, creating natural habitats that had been lost forever. Oceans, previously dying from pollution and acidification, now supported thriving marine life. Coral reefs had been restored, and fish populations were rebounding. Rivers and lakes, once stagnant and poisoned, flowed with clean fresh water that nourished both humans and wildlife. The work was not only restoration, it was transformation on a scale that no one on Aurelian 5 had imagined possible. In the cities, life slowly returned to normal. Roads and infrastructure that had been damaged or neglected during the crisis were repaired with such precision that many people barely recognized their own neighborhoods. Electrical systems were stabilized, and energy grids were strengthened to handle future demands. Air purification systems installed by the Deathworlders ensured that even industrial areas could now maintain clean air standards. People began to resume their daily routines, returning to work, school, and social activities. Yet, the presence of the fleet, even in absence, lingered in their minds. Everyone knew that the survival of their planet had not been the result of their own power, but of an alien species so powerful it could have destroyed them instantly. The psychological impact of the event was profound. For weeks, the people had lived in fear, believing that their world could be obliterated at any moment. Now, that fear had been replaced by gratitude and a deep sense of humility. Citizens began to understand the fragility of life and the importance of cooperation, both among themselves and with forces beyond their world. Schools incorporated lessons about the Deathworlders, teaching children not only about their power, but also about their unexpected act of compassion. Artists and writers began creating works inspired by the fleet, capturing the incredible transformation of the planet and the emotions of its people. The story of the fleet's intervention spread quickly, becoming part of the culture and identity of Aurelian 5, even as life resumed. Scientists continued to study the alien technology left behind. They documented every device, every system, and every process, trying to understand how it worked and how it could be maintained. Collaborations were formed between engineers, ecologists, and planetary scientists to ensure that the improvements were sustainable. They realized that the technology was not just advanced, it was intelligent. Many of the systems had self-regulating mechanisms, able to respond to environmental changes automatically. This meant that even without the Deathworlders present, the planet could continue to benefit from their intervention for generations. The planetary leaders also considered the broader implications of what had happened. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that even the most feared and powerful species could act with compassion and wisdom. The people of Aurelian 5 realized that fear often arose from misunderstanding, and that even beings capable of immense destruction could choose to help rather than harm. This lesson influenced not only their approach to future crises but also their interactions with other civilizations in the galaxy. Diplomacy, caution, and patience became central principles, informed by the understanding that appearances and assumptions could be misleading. On a personal level, the event left lasting impressions on every individual. Families remembered the nights spent hiding in shelters, the anxious hours staring at the sky, and the constant tension that had defined their lives. Now these memories were paired with the joy and amazement of seeing their world restored. Children who had been terrified now played in forests that had been replanted, learning about the plants, animals, and ecosystems that were returning. Adults took time to reflect, appreciating the fragility of their civilization and the extraordinary intervention that had saved it. The planet, once on the brink of collapse, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. The departure of the Deathworlder fleet was as quiet as its arrival. The ships, which had once loomed over the planet with terrifying presence, gradually moved away and disappeared into the darkness of space. There was no fanfare, no messages of goodbye, no ceremonies. Yet the people of Aurelian 5 felt a profound sense of gratitude. They understood that their survival and the restoration of their planet had not been guaranteed, had been a choice made by a species that could have chosen destruction at any moment. This understanding deepened their respect for the universe and for the forces beyond their comprehension. In the weeks and months that followed, the planet settled into a new normal. The people worked to maintain the ecosystems and technologies implemented by the Deathworlders, ensuring that the improvements were not lost. Education and public awareness campaigns were launched to teach citizens about sustainable living, ecosystem management, and environmental stewardship. The planet became more resilient, more connected, and more aware of its place in the galaxy. Communities celebrated not only the survival of their world but also the unity and cooperation that had carried them through the crisis. The story of the Deathworlders' intervention became legend. It was told and retold in homes, schools, and public gatherings. Citizens spoke of the terror they had felt, the awe-inspiring sight of the fleet, and the incredible transformation of their world. The story was a reminder of the power of understanding, the importance of patience, and the possibility of hope in the face of overwhelming fear. It became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary potential of life when compassion is chosen over destruction. Even though the fleet had left, its influence remained. The people of Aurelian 5 were changed forever, not just in their environment, but in their perspective on life, the universe, and each other. They had experienced firsthand that fear could be misleading, that misunderstanding could be deadly, and that even the most powerful forces could act with unexpected kindness. The planet was not only saved physically but had been given a profound lesson in humility, cooperation, and hope. Aurelian 5 stood renewed, its people stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. The planet had survived what seemed like an impossible threat, not through its own power, but through the intervention of the Deathworlders. The species feared across the galaxy for its immense destructive capabilities. The citizens had witnessed the extraordinary choice of mercy over destruction, and their world had been transformed as a result. As life continued, the story of the fleet became a permanent part of their history, a reminder of how close they had come to annihilation, and how a single act of compassion could rewrite the fate of an entire world.